what I was really getting myself into, and decided probably after a few months, I said, I think I want to major in organ in college. So we got all the materials that I needed to audition, and we worked on it. And behold, I actually auditioned and got in at East Carolina University. And that literally, it was a year of organ lessons, and then I started as an organ major.
Oh, cool. Chris, do you want to take the next couple of questions?
Michael, so what made you want to pursue a life of a professional church musician?
Two major things. I have always loved choirs, and I've always worked with choirs, and I love organ music. As a kid, if I heard an organ, anything that sounded like an organ, it didn't matter where I was, I would immediately stop and try to find out where the sound was coming from. So I've always loved working with choirs, and I've always loved playing and hearing organs. But I think the defining factor for me that really cemented me wanting to pursue this was my grandmother's sister was a trustee at the historic Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. And every year my grandparents would travel to New York to visit my grandmother's sister. And of course, on Sunday morning, we would go to Abyssinian. And so if you've never been or don't know anything about Abyssinian, it's an amazing Gothic building. I think there's a 5 manual chants there, and they've got thousands and thousands of members. The church was always packed when I went there. And when I would go to New York, I would make sure that I had a tape recorder back in the days of tape recorders. We'd go, and I bought a tape recorder, and I would go to church, and as soon as the organ music started, I would record the entire service from beginning to end, because I wanted to have that to take back with me to North Carolina and listen to. And after seeing that amazing church, hearing that amazing organ, and I remember, oh my goodness, now his name completely skips my mind. African-American organist. He died many, many years ago. But anyway, he was a substitute organist the Sunday I went. And I took pictures with him, had an opportunity to chat with him. And it was after that I decided, this is what I want to do. It has to be church music. Now, that said, everyone in my family thought, you will never make any money doing that, and you should probably go into teaching or something other than church music, because in my community, I mean, church musicians just did that as a part-time gig. They were music teachers in schools or did other jobs. So no one worked full-time, and no one knew anything about people that actually had that as a vocation. So I definitely pushed back on my family with that, because they were unsure why in the world I would want to do this thing and be poor the rest of my life.
Do you have any strong influences in your education?
Yes. I had the honor of studying with Jeanette Fishel, Dr. Jeanette Fishel, who is now the chair of the organ department at Indiana University, the Jacobs School. And I started with her at East Carolina University, where I went to school. And I worked with her there, as well as at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Greenville, which has a beautiful Fisk organ now that was put in a number of years ago. And you know, we all knew if you were an organ student of Jeanette Fishel's, you were going to have some dealings with St. Paul's Episcopal Church. And ironically, St. Paul's Episcopal Church is where your rector came from, Christopher.
Zoom does not like us today, that's for sure.
Uh-oh. I didn't know what happened.
It just went away.
Yeah.
All right, let's see. Let me get everybody set back up the right way here. Then let's see. Michael's unmuted, and then there you are, Chris.
All right, here we are.
All right, we're back. Hopefully it stays this time. This thing is not liking us today, so.
Goodness, no worries.
It's not letting me post it on Facebook either, and it's just giving me a message.
Gotcha.
Oh, well.
So I was just saying that I work with Jeanette Fishel, and then my work, she was director of music at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Greenville, North Carolina. And then I studied choral conducting with Dr. Rhonda Fleming and Daniel Barra. And all three of those, coupled with, I think one of the most amazing experiences I've ever had in an education was being invited to be a part of the Allendale International Organ Festival. And to be able to study with organists from around the world, just have an entire week to have one-on-one with amazing organists and scholars. So that in and of itself, those have been really my major influences in education there. I actually, I finished my undergraduate degree, I got a master's degree, and I did both undergraduate and master's at East Carolina in organ performance and choral conducting. And then decided to explore more of a theological perspective for my doctorate degree. And so I went to Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C., and got my doctor in ministry in art and theology in 2015. So I graduated in 2015. So all of that, you know, has really influenced me and helped me to be the musician that I am today.
All right. Well, what role does music and art play in your daily life?
And it's all I do.
Yeah.
There isn't a day or really a moment or many moments that go by that I am not thinking about music and the art. And it's just a part of my life. Many people have asked me, like, what are your hobbies? And I literally have to say, practicing. I actually love sitting at the organ console when I don't have anything else to take my attention away from it, and can just focus on playing organ music. I'm listening to choral music. I listen to choral music, sacred music, more than I listen to anything else. So I'm always thinking of new ideas. If I hear something, oh, would I be able to use this at this particular service or for a concert or what have you? So in my life, it's just an everyday thing. I wake up thinking about it. I go to bed thinking about it. And of course, being a full-time church musician, I'm doing it all day long. So it's just a part of my life. And I wouldn't have it any other way. I honestly wouldn't. It's fun to think about it. It allows me to spread my creative wings. It challenges me every day, and especially now, I'm being challenged in ways that I never imagined. Most things I'm not prepared for.
Right. Yeah.
And
like,
so I'm just, yes. I'm just trying to figure it out.
Yep.
And see what happens. But as difficult and challenging as that is, it's also allowing me to open my mind and think of new possibilities. So I'm trying to think of it in a positive light, dealing with what we're dealing with now. Mm-hmm. But yeah, music is just a part of my daily life.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, Chris, why don't you take the next one?
All right, let's talk a little bit about your career. So share with us a little bit about the various positions you've held.
All right. Well, I will try to make it as quick as possible so that I don't stay on one thing too long. Right out of when I was a junior in high school, my sister's now father-in-law was the minister at our church. He left that church, went to a church 2 hours away, and then his musician resigned and asked me if I would be his new musician. I didn't have to deal with choirs. I just had to be the accompanist. And my 11th grade year in high school, I would drive 2 hours one way for rehearsals and come back and go to school. And then Sunday morning, I would get up about 5 or 5:30 to be on the road by 7, to be where I needed to be at 9, where I would stay all day, and then drive back and do school the next day. So that was at a Baptist church in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, 2 hours north of where I grew up. I had held that position for 2.5 years. When I entered college, I took another position at Jarvis United Methodist Church in Greenville, North Carolina. It was one of the largest Methodist churches in the conference at that time. And I took the organist position there, and I worked there throughout the rest of my time at East Carolina University. After that, I accepted a position as Associate Director of Music and Organist at Friendship Baptist Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, one of the few African-American churches that still did some classical music as well as gospel and other things. And they had a 4-manual pipe organ. So that was quite rare in African-American churches. So I did that for 2 years. Enjoyed it, learned a lot, but I realized that something within me said, you are an Episcopalian and you probably need to get your master's. And so after 2 years of that, I went back to school, moved back to Greenville, North Carolina, and then I took a position at a United Methodist Church in Tarboro, North Carolina, where I did choir and organ there. And I did that for 2 years while I was doing my master's. And then after I got my master's, I then accepted the position as Director of Music and Organist at St. Michael's Cathedral in Boise, Idaho, which was a huge step because I knew nothing about Idaho. I had to look it up on the map because who knows anything past St. Louis? What else is there if you live on the East Coast? And so I accepted that position thinking that I would only do it for about 3 to 5 years. It's way out west, and it was a very small church, but lovely community. But I didn't imagine that there would be a reason for me to stay very long. Well, the 3 to 5 years turned into 12 and a half. And I enjoyed every moment of it. And I think those were some of the most formative years in my vocation as director of music. So I learned a lot there. And then after St. Michael's, I kind of felt that it was time to do something else. And so the position came open at Christ Church Cathedral, Indianapolis. And so after going through the process there, I was offered the position at Christ Church. So I moved to Christ Church in March of 2015. And did that for 5 years and learned lots and had wonderful experiences there. But a little tidbit here that I'll insert now that I didn't talk about earlier. Back in 1998, I attended the National AGO Convention, which was held here in Denver. And then John Scott, the late John Scott, was one of the main organists that played a concert, and he happened to play at St. John's. So it was the first time I ever walked into St. John's Cathedral. And the moment I walked in, I sat down and I looked around and I said, I want to be director of music here one day, back in 1998. And thought nothing of it after that, had a great time and went on with life. And then the position came open at St. John's, and I thought, well, why not? And I applied, and just so happened that it just seemed like a good match. And then I was called to St. John's in 2019. So is that right? Yes. Everything is running together these days. Actually 2018.
Okay.
So anyway, I accepted the position, and here I am now, just a little over a year as director of music at St. John's. It's a wonderful place, and as you mentioned earlier, what's not to love about 113 ranks of gorgeous Kimball organ in an amazing room?
I haven't seen it since the back organ was done.
You will have to see it and hear it because it's absolutely amazing.
We'll plan on it someday, that's for sure.
Yes.
All right. Well, we all tend to have a common thread that runs through each position. What would you describe as yours?
I think mine is introducing music of a variety of cultures in churches. Everywhere I've gone, starting with St. Michael's, I started introducing them to music written by African American composers, Latin American composers, and I continued that at Christ Church Cathedral and have continued that here at St. John's. It seems to be something that I feel called to do, but it's also a part of who we are, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but it's who we are as Episcopalians. We have so much diversity. That's just kind of been a common thread, and that's something that's come up in all of the interviews, because they've all been talking about broadening their musical scope, and how do we do that, and where do we start? And so since St. Michael's, every parish I've served, I've tried to broaden their scope in music of other cultures.
There's always a bit of fear about how that goes about. I think especially when you have a new music director coming in, folks always ask that question, and I think personally, it's always one of those that I kind of go into with trepidation, because I'm like, are they asking for this change, or are they scared of this change? That type of thing.
Exactly.
So, of course, as you know, there's a way of doing it without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So,
well, one of the things that I loved about my interview at St. John's, they always ask the question, people say, we want to broaden our musical scope. And they knew my history, and I shared with them what that means.
Mm-hmm.
I turned around and asked them, what does that mean to you?
Right.
Because that could be totally different than what I'm envisioning. So It was an important question that I'd never thought to ask, but for whatever reason, in that moment, I said, well, what does that mean, and what does that look like? How does that manifest itself to you? And it was a great question, and I think they appreciated having that feedback, because it allowed them to think about, well, what do we envision this looking like?
Sure.
At St. John's. Mm-hmm.
All right, Chris, you're
up. Do you have a favorite story from your career? Anything that stands out?
Yes, I have a couple short ones. One of the most amazing experiences and invitations that I've ever gotten was to be the chief musician at the 2015 General Convention of the Episcopal Church, which was a huge undertaking. And just the way it happened was kind of interesting and weird, because at the time I was asked, lived in Boise, Idaho. And I was close enough to Salt Lake City, Utah, that I could work with musicians in the Intermountain West. But before the convention happened, I moved to Indianapolis. So I ended up traveling almost across country for the convention. But what an amazing experience for me to work with jazz musicians. And I think we did some of every kind of music there. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. And that was a major experience for me. And one of the fun story from that was playing the Vidor Toccata with Theodicy Jazz Collective. While, you know, they had their little riffs that they would do in between little sections. And so it was always a barn burner. Everybody loves the Vidor Toccata. And then to have that with jazz musicians was just amazing. The other one was doing a residency at Winchester Cathedral in 2014. I took St. Michael's Cathedral in Boise. We were in residence there, and that was a life-changing experience. They had never done it, and it was my first time taking a choir too. I had gone on a couple others as just a singer, but I'd never taken a choir there myself. And so that was a moment that I will always remember. It changed my life, and it definitely changed the lives of the choir at the cathedral. So that was a fun story. The hilarious story happened most recently. St. John's Cathedral, Christmas Eve at the 8 o'clock High Mass. And we had brass and organ, and we were all set to go. And we started out, and organ rang through, and about 5 measures in, I realized something was wrong. Keep in mind, this was my first Christmas. And the 32-foot Waldhorn decided to cipher.
There you go.
And there was nothing we could do about it. So the brass is still playing, but this the lowest note, low C, just hung on the entire time. And so we're still singing, the procession is still going on. I'm trying to work with my associate to figure out what in the world is going on, to then figure out, oh my gosh, we can't stop this cipher. We're going to have to finish the hymn. He's going to have to turn the organ off, run to the piano, and get ready for the mass setting we were singing, and he's going to have to accompany on piano. Luckily, he came back to the organ for the psalm, and everything was just fine. So it's a Christmas I'll always remember.
Those any sort of reed cipher, and it's always the reeds that cipher too.
Always. But I thought, what are people thinking? Like, because I was brand new. I had just hired my associate, 2 months prior. And so it was our kind of debut. Here we are on Christmas Eve at St. John's Cathedral with 1,000 people sitting in the congregation, and it's ciphers. So we laughed about it afterwards.
For those of you who don't get the organ lingo, basically a 32-foot Waldhorn is a big, basically a big trumpet that's playing the lowest note on the organ, and it basically would sound like a helicopter landing.
Yeah. And it was not in tune because it wasn't in the key of anything that we were doing after all the chord changes. So it was interesting, to say the least.
Oh, cool. All right, well, let's move to our next section a little bit here. So while the Episcopal Church works hard to be inclusive, the majority of our congregations tend to be white and older. Can you share some of your experiences with the church, especially instances that have promoted some diversity and maybe some instances that have caused some division?
Well, they can almost be one and the same. As I spoke about earlier, introducing lots of musical diversity, I started doing a lot of education, writing lots of newsletter articles about spirituals, gospel music, and not just what we understand. Well, spirituals and gospel music, but also music written by people of color. Um, and, you know, a lot of churches are saying, yeah, we want to do this, but at the same time, they don't want to do it. And there are lots of reasons because of that. But I've done spiritual concerts, gospel concerts, and I had the good fortune at Christ Church, Indianapolis. They had a fairly substantial Latin American community. And I had the opportunity to work with the young lady that conducted the choir for the Latin American choir. And she's a master's student from IU. And she taught me lots about Latin American culture, Latin American music, rhythms, all of those things, to a point that we understood each other's language, because I was amazed at the overlap with Latin American music, gospel music, and then you've got the European style. So we connected on all of those, and we literally did everything, even with me coming up with appropriate accompaniments with classical guitarists playing music from Latin America, and how all of that meshed together. So it was a real learning experience for me to see the overlap in the musical cultures. And how important that is to showcase in all of our music. Of course, when you do that, it's going to rub some people wrong, because you will get bogged down in what is the authentic music. Well, if I talk about Latin America, Mexico, two different things. How they, if you're from Mexico, there's a certain style of music that you're accustomed to. But if you're from South America, it's completely different. And so there can be conflicting, you can't group it all together. And so just learning about all of that and trying to ease people into, okay, it's okay that you don't know everything about this, but we are here to teach you. No different than having the English speakers sing in Spanish. And so I tried not to just have Spanish music at the Spanish speaking service and English music at the English speaking service. When we did bilingual services, I made sure that the English choir had to learn some Spanish and the Spanish choir had to learn some English music. And it was just getting people out of their comfort zones and saying, we're all going to be one community, we have to learn from each other and learn each other's cultures. It doesn't mean that that's the thing that we will have a steady diet of, but it is about all of us coming together and acknowledging who we are and where we come from and what has helped make us who we are.
What are some steps that every church can take to become more inclusive and promote diversity?
Make it a priority for the overall ministry. If you relegate it to a particular ministry, you're not going to do anything but silo that. So you've got to make it a priority across the board and have forums on it, have your musicians, your clergy go to conferences to learn a little bit more. And it takes time. It really does take time. And I understand what it means to push back on that, because now I'll talk about myself. When I'm learning new things, even learning a new organ piece, the worst part about it for me is beginning the process. Now, after I figured out some things start to make sense. Then I enjoy it. But I have to realize I have to go through that weird period at the very beginning where I won't know everything about it. and realize that everything that I think I know about, I really don't know anything about because I will learn new things when I begin to talk to other people. So I think having everybody make that a priority, I think our churches need to make that a priority, because if we don't, we are just doing the same things over and over again, and we are not really doing ministry in the way that we are called to do ministry. And that's for musicians, clergy, everybody. But it's a conversation that needs to happen across the board in order to make a huge difference.
You already mentioned siloing to some, but are there any other big mistakes in that process?
Making assumptions is a huge mistake, and then learning to learn a little bit can be very dangerous, because if you learn just a little bit about something, there's that tendency to say, now I'm an authority on that, but I know very little about that. So it's just I think we're at a place that we just need to be a lot more open to that, and you have to have the conversations, because you have to figure out how to do that in your congregation. And it's not about just exploring culture in a certain period of time. It's about looking at the totality of it, and that can be challenging, because to listen to Latin American, as an example, Baroque music is not like listening to Latin American contemporary music. It's so starkly different. We would understand Latin American sacred music from the Baroque period.
Yeah.
That's easy to digest because it's not that different from, Bach and, but you go beyond that, and then it opens up something totally different. So just making sure that we're just being open and honest about it.
Cool. Very good. All right, Chris, you're up.
What are your thoughts, like general thoughts, on the state of church music in America?
Oh, state of church music in America. I think we are in a very challenging place, but it can be challenging in a good way. And what I mean by that, I really think that we have a lot to learn. We have to figure out the church's role, we have to figure out what our role is as the church in the 21st century. And there's been so much change, and there have been so many things that have been added. And, we don't use typewriters anymore. We don't use word processors anymore. It's all on computer. And now we really don't talk on phones anymore. We text everything, and now we're doing Zoom. Many of us right now are doing online services where we've never done that before. So there's this constant evolution that's happening. And I think the church has been behind a lot of that and been slow to change. The early church actually were in the forefront. The church said, this is the direction we need to go. This is what we need to be doing. And so the church took it upon themselves, for good or ill, to set an example. And then the community followed after that. It's kind of been reversed now. And in a lot of ways, the church kind of follows rather than works with or leads. So I think we're in a challenging time, but I think it's an opportunity for us to grow. It's an opportunity for us to reevaluate who we are and whose we are and what our role is going to be going forward. We have so much. We have so much to offer, and I'll just talk about the Episcopal Church. We have such a breadth of diversity in the Episcopal Church, but at the same time, we have to be intentional about showcasing that diversity, and sensitive to how we represent that diversity in our offerings. There are a lot of times you can do something and not realize that it's offended a certain group of people. And so it's just this constant learning and relearning who we are and what we are about, and how we can continue to model what it really means to be children of God and leaders in the church, and building up of God's kingdom here on earth. But that's difficult. I think it's a tall task, because there are a lot of conversations. I mean, right now, we're talking. Who's not talking about race? Who's not talking about the pandemic? Who's not talking about these things? And we can't sweep these things under the rug, because they are important issues that we've somewhat tried to address in the past, but we really haven't dealt with the deep issues that will make us transformed. And so it's time for us to talk about what aren't we doing, but at the same time, not always looking at it, we've got to do this instead of this now. I just don't have that mentality. I think we can have it both. We can have both things. I think of broadening our scope without necessarily tossing out any particular thing. I say that loosely, but I think it's important that we think of it as broadening and not trading one thing for the next, because someone's always left out when you do that.
Just bring it back a little bit to kind of where we generally go default setting in Episcopal world. Talk a little bit about your thoughts about sort of that whole European style of things, of doing things, and how you personally merge into it, where we can go with all of that.
Well, I think the very first question we have to ask is, what do we mean when we talk about Anglicanism? What does that mean, and how people interpret that? Are we talking about the Church of England, or are we talking about anyone who is linked to the Anglican Communion? Two different things. I think many times we get lost in Church of England and misinterpret being Anglican as being Church of England and not the wider Anglican communion. I heard a bishop say once, she said, Anglicanism is a lot broader than the way many people understand it and how they interpret it. So in a lot of ways, I've kind of steered clear of using the word Anglican because it's misinterpreted to mean from England, of the Church of England. And so I think that's, especially in music circles, church music circles, we've gotten stuck in this wheel, and we just keep going around and around and around because we haven't thought broader of the word Anglicanism. And so we relegate that to beautiful Anglican chant, high Victorian, Elizabeth, whatever, anything that comes from England, that is the true church music. That's not the case for the Episcopal Church, is it? Because we have such diversity in the church. The Anglican choral tradition is a part of who we are, but it's not all of who we are. And so there's so much diversity, many other cultures that we need to pay attention to in order to really say, this is the church that we are. We are made up of a lot of different cultures, and it's important for us to acknowledge that, because that's going to directly affect who comes into our church and who goes out. And I think that it's a challenge for all of us.
Chris, you want to go on to that next question?
Sure. You know, as we were saying, church music continually evolves. And there are some of us who do remember the so-called worship wars, where, you know, the answer to everything was to throw a praise band in there. As we expand our musical offerings, do you think there's a way to avoid another sort of worship war?
Yes. I love that question, because I've answered that question a number of times over the past year and a half at some conferences. The first thing, no matter what you do, you need to treat whatever you're trying to learn about like you would anything else. My prime example is Latin American music, African American music, Asian American music. All of that deserves the same study and attention as the music of Bach, Vierne, Vidor, Tallis, anyone. We, in our schools of music and in many seminaries, we don't talk about that. It's kind of a, you do it as tokenism. So, we're gonna do a spiritual today. It's usually done, not all the time, but in a lot of cases, it's done very poorly. People don't like it, and then they rail against it. And then it's like, if you do that again, I'm going to withdraw my pledge. I'm not coming into this church anymore, because now I don't recognize this church. When the church, meaning our seminaries and schools of music, have done and are doing, continue to do, many of us, a disservice by not giving us the opportunity to study this style of music. There's no different in we study jazz music. Why wouldn't we study music from Latin America and not talk about one area of Latin American music, but talk about it in its totality? What about the church music in Latin America? What about the African American gospel and spiritual traditions? We can study those. There's a way to approach them. But I really think we spend so much time lifting up one or two genres and styles and leaving everything else. Well, that's less than. And I don't see it that way. I think it's all important. And we will do our congregations better by sharing with them what this music is about, where it came from. Do a series of forums, write a series of articles, and not only write the articles, but then pair music up that you are doing in worship with that and have some explanation. I oftentimes, if I'm introducing new music, I will forego the prelude that Sunday morning. We're going to have a congregational rehearsal. This is a different style of music, but it's a part of the diversity that we enjoy in the Episcopal Church. So here we go. It won't be a steady diet of it, but I think it needs to be represented. The other thing about that, I talked with my former bishop, the Bishop of Indianapolis, Jennifer Baskerville Burroughs. We were at a conference and we were just talking about music, and she said, you know, even in rural Indiana, there are a few churches. There are, I mean, sometimes when she goes on her visit, she's the only person of color in the room, especially in rural Indiana. And she says, I can go to some of those churches and they are singing music out of Livas, and there's not another person of color in there except for me. And it's in the pew and they use it as part of their musical lexicon. So they aren't waiting for people of a particular culture to be a part or express an interest to be a part of the church. They're doing it because they are a part of the church, and we should be doing this anyway. So then it doesn't become tokenism. Oh, the bishop is coming. Well, we're going to sing, you know, Kumbaya. And then after she leaves, we'll go back to singing whatever we did before. I don't think that's helpful. I think it sends a bad example. I think we should be doing this because it is a part of who we are as Americans and Episcopalians. So being able to study, to learn as much as we can about other cultures, and finding appropriate ways to incorporate it into our liturgy so that it doesn't necessarily feel like a big liturgical or musical speed bump. There's nothing worse for me than going along in a service, and this may not be everyone's opinion, but I like things to kind of blend together and have some semblance of continuity. But to go in and you've sung high Anglican music, if you will, and then all of a sudden there's this gospel or spiritual song that pops out of nowhere that liturgically probably doesn't even have any place in the service. That's a jolt for me. And I think our musicians and our liturgists in our churches have to take the time, and it does take time, to say, how can I blend this together and weave it together so that I'm not trying to get it extremely smooth, but that there at least is a common thread through that. And that just takes a lot of study and know-how and just the ability to be open to doing some new things and experiencing some new things.
What do you think the church can bring to the world, especially through art and music, especially in this time of pandemic and racial tension?
Oh, a sense of unity and an appreciation for the many facets which have shaped and influenced us all. I think I'm happy to have had a number of conversations with musicians from across the country who've expressed an interest in broadening our musical scope and diversity. And the question is, how do we do that? Because I'm white. That's what they're saying to me. I'm white. I don't have a person of color in my congregation or in my choir, but I see this as a need. How do we do that? So I'm happy to hear that those conversations are starting to happen more frequently now. And I've said this, what I just said to you, to all of us, I've said to them, we've got to do it because it's what we're supposed to do. It's what we're called to do. And it's not about satisfying a particular person or group that is in the space. We've just got to do that work, because if we don't, after all of this is over, we are going to still be in the same place that we were pre-COVID and really talking about racism in the way that we're talking about it now. So I just think it's vitally important for us to unify ourselves, and be appreciative, because we've all been influenced by it. It's so funny to me. You can, no matter what Episcopal church you go to, there are going to be some gospel American hymns that are not in any English hymnal. And you can play that in an Episcopal church and people will weep. And you would never have imagined that they would know that stuff. But it really is a part of who we are and what has shaped us. So I think it's vitally important that we show that unity.
If you had one thing to say to church musicians, either volunteer or professional, what would that be?
Ooh. Our work is ministry, period. The moment that what we do and how we do it, the moment it becomes solely about us as individuals, or about my choir and our organ, and look at what we've done, and look at what we can do, and look at how awesome we are, ministry ceases to happen. We are ministers, ordained or not. We are called to be to the ministry of music. We have people's faith and people's, we have so much at our fingertips, and we are responsible for so much. And music and art has a way of changing lives. And I don't take that lightly. And I really don't want to see any of us focus more on the performance and forget that we are about ministry. Now, I say that because I'm performing now. If I'm talking, I'm delivering something, I'm performing. When I'm playing, there is an aspect of performance in what we do. But that can't be the thing that we focus on. We've got to focus on the ministry side of that. Right now, people's lives and souls are in turmoil. And this is challenging for church musicians, because church musicians are, in large part, are no longer able to do the thing that they studied and do it in a way that makes them feel good about themselves. And now they're at home doing music online, and they're down to a quartet versus having the 65 people in the chancel and having the organ blare and having the congregation sing. It's such a different world right now. And what is most important in my eyes is ministering in a different way to our people. As much as we love music and singing, and I am totally sad that we aren't able to sing in person, but that isn't the only aspect of our role in our ministry. You know, I have choir members that have had surgery or have lost a loved one. It's my responsibility to reach out to them and minister to them, in addition to the clergy doing their part pastorally. You know, a colleague of mine said many years ago, he said, you know, the choir really is a sub-congregation of the church, because it's probably the largest group of people that meets regularly, more than any other group. So musicians, directors of music, really are lay ministers in that regard. So it's about seeing it as ministry, and not letting our egos get in the way of that. And if we can step back and do ministry like we are truly called, I think we can change the world. We can change the face of church music. We can do so much more than what we have done.
Well, any closing thoughts thoughts. I got at least one question to cover from folks online here. So.
Um, I am appreciative of this opportunity. And again, having this conversation goes right into the fact that different types of conversations are being held now. That warms my heart to know that people are wanting to talk about these things and not just on the surface. The questions that you've asked me are not surface questions. And I by no means have given a definitive answer to anything because everything is fluid. But we've got to wrestle with all of these questions and figure out how we might achieve these things in our own communities and not use anyone else's as a basis necessarily. Okay, we're having to do that. I'm dealing with that with what we do going forward in the fall. Every church in every diocese is doing something slightly differently. And it's not to say that one thing is better than the next. And I've just resolved that at this time, with the resources that I have and the folks that I have to work with, this is what is going to work for us at St. John's. It won't look like the church down the street or the other Episcopal church in Colorado Springs. We have to work within our own means right now because there's so many unknowns. But yeah, let's not be afraid. Let's not be afraid to experiment. And it's okay to get it wrong. I would rather us try and get it wrong and know that we can try it a different way than to not try it all.
Well, one question that we have at this point is just sort of resources that folks can use. We have Lift Every Voice and Sing, Leave Off, but are there any others that folks should know about?
You know, I think the best resources now are going to be via conferences, webinars, Zooms, just like what we're doing now. We're finding, I mean, there's some information that I can't really find that I'm looking for because a lot of it hasn't been written yet. And I know there are a number of conferences coming up that'll be done virtually that will speak specifically to what we've been talking about. I think Dr. Mickey Thomas Terry is going to do one at Indiana University at the Jacobs School talking about African-American organ composers. Yuri Rodriguez, who was the young lady that I worked with in Indianapolis, is now starting seminary at Sewanee. She's going to be a resource that I use to talk about Latin American music. And so I think right now, most of it will have to be virtual and talking one-on-one. But from that, I think more information, more resources will be made available. And we'll have more to actually look and thumb through to kind of figure out. But it's taken us this long, which is why we don't have the resources, because a lot of this was shoved and said, no, we don't want to put too much stock into this, but here we are in the 21st century and we are way behind. And not just the Episcopal Church, but we are way behind on that. And so if I come across any major resources, I will. I know Eileen Gunther and Anton Armstrong are doing a virtual workshop, a webinar around this very thing, spirituals and gospel music, the African-American tradition. So it's starting now. And we're getting some very qualified and key individuals to be a part of this. And so I think we just stay tuned and attend as much as we can.
one of these days, Anton will let me live down the fact that I pushed him in the pool when I was in fifth grade.
Oh, does he remember that?
He does. It was at the American Boy Choir summer camp that I went to.
My goodness.
And it was the last year he directed that. That's why he remembers it.
Oh, gotcha. Well, you were memorable. That experience was memorable.
Well, everyone else, I've enabled the ability for you to unmute yourself. So if you have any questions, fire away. Looked like my dad was doing something there, but I'm not sure what he's doing. No, he's not. He's just sitting up. All right. Well, if nobody has any other questions, thanks again for coming tonight, and thank you, Michael, for being here. It's been a wonderful conversation. I think pretty informative for a lot of folks, and we touched a lot of different areas there. And
sure. And I would like to say, feel free to email me if you have questions later. Just email me. Just go to St. John's Cathedral, Denver, and you can go on the Cathedral website, find my email, and I would love to be able to talk with you, answer any questions you might have in the future.
In 2 weeks, we have Bill Roberts and his partner David talking about sort of anxiety deals with music, the fact that we can't sing in choirs right now, and certain ways that you can kind of maybe cope with some of the stress around that subject. So again, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Michael. Thanks,
You're welcome.
Chris. And hopefully we'll see you next time.
Okay, thanks for having me. Have a good evening.